Peter Marshall. Well, Tony Blair captured one part of the argument about the Middle East conflict with a speech in which he claimed that reactionary Islam could only be countered by moderate Muslims, Jews and Christians working together. Tim Hugh reports on whether what the Prime Minister calls the arc of extremism is just the English translation of George Bush's axis of evil.
On the surface, it's a conflict about borders, about prisoners, about security. But through the smoke, Tony Blair discerns an elemental struggle for the values that will shape all our futures.
There is an arc of extremism now stretching across the Middle East and touching with increasing definition countries far outside that region.
At one end of that arc is what Tony Blair calls reactionary Islam. He's thinking partly of the force that rules Iran and has armed Hezbollah. The trajectory of extremism passes on through Iraq, where Shia and Sunni Muslims have been slaughtering one another. It traverses Syria, a state Blair lumps with Iran as a constant source of destabilisation and reaction. And it ends in Lebanon, torn apart by war since Hezbollah, the party of God, launched a surprise attack on Israel. The battle today is in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. But in the long term, the Prime Minister believes it must be fought in the hearts and minds of Muslims everywhere. Against what he calls reactionary Islam, Mr. Blair wants to set an alliance of moderation. And there's nowhere better he might look for allies than this. This London mosque belongs to a Shia Muslim foundation closely linked to the chief Shia religious authorities in Iraq. They welcomed the fall of Saddam Hussein. They advocate a pluralistic political system, and they try to build bridges between Shia and Sunni. But they don't necessarily agree with the British Prime Minister about the causes of extremism. This young mullah knows the Shia militants Hezbollah are now heroes across the Arab world, even among Sunni Muslims. But they've gained that status, he believes, because they're the only force opposing Israeli attacks.
The level of suffering that people are witnessing amongst the civilian population of Lebanon, the enduring images that are coming there from Lebanon are the most likely factor to affect the future politics of the Middle East. It is Lebanon that will make or destroy ideologies, systems, movements, not Iran.
Shia Muslims, a group who once thought of themselves as victims of oppression, are now gaining a more powerful status in the region. And the phrase arc of extremism seems partly to reflect the idea of a Shiite crescent stretching from Iran to Lebanon. But many Shia are moderates, and where they've been attracted to what Mr. Blair calls extremism, it's for many different reasons, not all theological. In Iran, there's been a dramatic increase in officially inspired anti-Western rhetoric since President Ahmadinejad came to power, but the country's defiance is linked partly to the impasse in negotiations over its nuclear industry. In Iraq, the sectarian killings have many motives. They stem partly from the struggle to gain a share of power and resources as a new political structure is established. Shia religious leaders, despite their close links with Iran, have acted mainly as a moderating influence. In Lebanon, Hezbollah were originally armed and trained by Iran, but increasingly they now operate independently of their sponsors as a Lebanese political and military force. So, is the picture simply too complex to talk of an arc of extremism?
There isn't an arc of extremism. Indeed, there are a series of different groups that have sprung out of specific problems. Hezbollah was born because of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It's grown because of the failure to sort out the sense of grievances directed both at the Lebanese state, but more importantly at the Israeli state. Iranian influence in Iraq has been born of the mistakes of the US invasion. Therefore, these radical groups have grown up in specific geopolitical problems. The arc isn't an arc at all.
To defeat extremism, Tony Blair wants to strengthen modernising forces in the Middle East. But in the real world of diplomacy, He and other Western leaders have to deal with Arab states which often describe themselves as moderate, but are sometimes very far from being modern. The Prime Minister's obviously trying to find alternatives, but it's not proving easy. Among the countries Mr. Blair singles out as possible partners are the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain and Kuwait. They've certainly implemented modest reforms, but they're small and highly peripheral to the politics of the region. He mentions Egypt, though he admits political change there is very slow. But he completely ignores two of the most significant Arab actors, Jordan and, crucially, Saudi Arabia, even though it's known to oppose Hezbollah and other forms of Shia radicalism. In the context of the current Middle East conflict, Saudi Arabia certainly counts as a moderate country, but it's played an important role in the growth of Sunni militant movements, including Al-Qaeda. Now, some think those groups may intensify their activity to challenge the growing status of Shia Hezbollah.
We are watching a frightening period with an escalation of violence. There is a competition among terrorists of who is in the lead to defend the Arab Muslim cause.
Is democracy the solution to extremism? Mr. Blair, like President Bush, believes it is. But the forces that democracy brings to power aren't always moderate, and they may make alliances that cut across the Prime Minister's neat definitions of reactionary and modern.
There's now general consensus that the Muslim Brotherhood will come to power in Egypt in the next 10 to 20 years. And because of their historically close ties to Iran, in particular the Islamic regime in Iran, an Islamic Egypt would very likely ally itself with Iran.
What Mr. Blair and many leaders in the Middle East share is a deep interest in the role of ideology and religion. But it's a region where dividing lines are often blurred and allegiances complex. The kind of involvement the Prime Minister wants may as often be part of the problem as part of the solution.